Hello, everyone. We'll just give attendees just another 30 seconds or so to get going, and then we'll get started. Thank you for joining us. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to our webinar on future-proofing your workforce. I'm Iain Fitzpatrick. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Archetype. For those of you unfamiliar with us, we're a professional services firm whose difference is that we have the operating model of a consultancy with the economic model of a fund. What that means is that our innovation and growth consulting trades margin for market access that allows us to make investments from our own fund. Benefits of this difference to the various parts of our ecosystem are that our consulting clients get our top tier talent at below top tier rates, so see a higher return on investment. Our portfolio companies get access to that same top tier talent to accelerate their growth, talent that companies of that size couldn't otherwise reasonably expect to get access to. And our investors get a sustainable above market returns that our model provides. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Ranjit de Sousa, an advisor to Archetype. Ranjit works with work tech ventures across the globe, helping them scale their businesses. All these are ventures that are trying to change how we work tomorrow. Ranjit formerly led the largest coaching and career development company globally, and he's passionate about all things future of work, digital, and football, soccer to some of our friends. So Ranjit and I share a number of passions, if not football teams, a rivalry that we will put aside at least for the course of today. So Ranjit, welcome. Thank you for your time today and for all you do to support the Archetype ecosystem. The title, as I said, of our discussion is Future-Proofing the Organization. And to give attendees a roadmap for our chat today, Ranjit, I'll share here that you will start with your take on the macro situation and to provide the necessary context for our discussion today. You'll then translate that to the key people issues that business leaders are concerned with. You'll then drill down into the critical issue of how organizations can and should upskill and reskill as a way of tackling skill gaps. And then you'll talk about how leaders balance prioritizing business growth with an employee-centered approach. And we'll summarize that by way of wrap up and leave opportunity for Q&A. And we'll say to attendees, we got access obviously to all the questions that you post there, and we'll be delighted to tackle those at the end. So again, welcome Ranjit, and let's start with the macro situation. I guess most of us wouldn't have expected 12 months ago that the global pandemic wasn't necessarily the top issue that our business and political leaders were concerned with. So we live in interesting times, as some of our friends would say. Maybe you can give your take on that macro situation, as say, by way of giving context to the rest of our discussion.
Absolutely, and first off, thank you for having me, Iain. Very excited to be here today, and really looking forward to some of these big meaty topics that we're going to be talking about. Look, I think the macro situation that we're seeing here is probably putting business in front of some of the biggest challenges that we've seen in the last 30 years plus. Right. On the one hand, you have COVID, which has worked a little as a slingshot into the future. So many trends which we were seeing anyway have been massively accelerated. Not only when it comes to the workforce, but also just more generally for business when it comes to how you structure your supply chains, the resilience of the supply chains, and then obviously the use of technology. Right, many businesses pre-COVID were not thinking of an omni-channel approach, say, and have effectively been forced into that frame now in the last 24 months, to the point where your local deli has an e-commerce approach today, right? So COVID clearly has been a massive shift. But to your point, right, who would have thought that we would have some other really, really big challenges in front of us? Inflation, maybe not quite surprising for those who have followed kind of what monetary policy has been over the last decade. But still, I think it has come a little bit as a surprise at how, what the impact is. Just seeing the recent numbers just today, inflation in Germany, historically, obviously, a really critical topic, a very touchy topic in Germany, over 7%. So, inflation across the board, and I don't want to take too much of a Eurocentric view, but clearly having a major war in Europe for the first time since World War II is also going to have a huge impact on business, how we operate, what that means for supply chains, for globalization. And so if I take that kind of one step further in terms of what does it mean for the workforce and how we view as business leaders the workforce, I think there are a couple of elements there. Right? One is it exacerbates the skill shortages that we were seeing even pre-COVID. Companies requiring data scientists, digital marketeers, coders, cyber specialists, to name kind of the 3 or 4 most sought after skill areas. That's just gotten exacerbated because you have a huge amount of demand, an increase in demand, and in terms of supply, nothing really has changed. Inflation also creates even more of an issue because inflation is also leading to wage inflation, and especially in these areas where you already are seeing a real issue in terms of how a company is able to pay for those skills, those rare skills, that is getting even worse and making a difficult situation even worse, right? And then you have the general uncertainty generated through these 3 big trends of COVID, inflation, and the war in Ukraine, which makes decision making in a business context even harder. So yeah, those would be kind of my initial thoughts around kind of the macro situation and how that may translate into how you view the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, the World Bank just yesterday sort of said, we're talking about the biggest shocked prices in 50 years, and clearly at the very top of business leaders' issues. So let's now take that macro context and translate it into the people issues that businesses are dealing with. I spent 20 years at a company called Hay Group, a global consultancy in the people space, and it was talking to a former colleague just last week. He said, in 30 years of his line of work, he's never been so busy in terms of those people issues, very much being, on the top of the CEO's list. So, how would you translate that macro situation into people issues today, and I say slingshotting into the future?
Yeah, so I think the number one people issue that you have strategically is all around the skills shift, right? So how do you as a company deal with the fact that 30, 40, 50% of your workforce is going to have skills which are redundant in the coming 2 or 3 years. Right? And this is a pretty consistent stat across the globe, across industries, right? Whether you go into banking and insurances, or if you're looking at automotive manufacturing, these stats are pretty consistent. So how do you solve for that, right? And a lot of the toolbox that you were using previously is just not going to be very helpful there, right? You cannot solve it through making certain people redundant, those with the redundant skills, and hiring, because both in terms of the scope and scale of what you're trying to do there, that wouldn't be feasible, financially responsible, and probably socially responsible. And then again, as we were just talking about a moment ago, right, there is not sufficient supply of many of the skills that companies need, right? So that is probably the number one strategic topic. But at the same time, it's overlaid by a much more, I would say, short-term tactical topic, and that is how do you deal with hybrid work? Right? You can see that, and here the surveys are pretty clear in terms of where that's heading. Employees, in large majority, 70-80%, do not want to return back to an office where they work 5 days a week and in kind of the environment that they were in pre-COVID. Right? And this holds true pretty much across the Western world, I would say, across most developed economies. At the same time, we can see that many leaders, for some very good reasons, want their employees to be in the office at least 2 or 3, maybe more days a week. Right? So how do you actually solve for this tension, and what are the options that you have here, especially if you take that then in context of that skill shortage, right, where you cannot afford to and pardon my French, piss off people when you're trying to attract them to your company.
Yeah. So maybe I can ask you to drill down on this issue of upskilling and reskilling, Angie. I mean, again, purpose of our, one of the purposes of the discussion today is to sort of have people take away some actionable items. How do you see best-in-class organizations tackling the skills gap through upskilling and reskilling?
Yeah, and so the thing I would start with is there's no silver bullet, right? I think, or if there is a silver bullet, it is experimentation. Right? So you cannot approach this with a one-size-fits-all and a dogmatic approach, right? So what I've seen companies who are really successful at this doing is starting small, starting with experiments, understanding also from a diagnostic perspective, right? Where do they actually have the biggest skill gaps, but also where do they have skill gaps which are big but can be bridged? Right? Because if you know that you have a huge skill gap somewhere, but it is not bridgeable, then there is probably no point in investing into reskilling or even more so in upskilling. But if you know that there is a skills gap which can be closed in a meaningful way, and in a fairly reasonable time frame, then that's where you want to be focusing on. So if I take an insurance company, for example, you have claims adjusters. Claims adjustment has been radically impacted by automation and machine learning. So things which used to be done by humans in terms of calculations and evaluations are today done by apps and all the machine learning behind it, which is evaluating photographs taken by users with their insurance apps and so on, right? So effectively, that is redundant workforce within insurances. Now these people have two huge advantages, right? They have the cognitive abilities, typically, they're mathematically skilled, and that is a good foundation to actually be reskilled in direction of topics like data analytics, data science, which is one of the areas which is most, where insurances have the biggest gaps. And so, you're looking at a talent pool where the skill gaps are probably not too big, and where you can actually start with a reskilling experiment, which might be pretty successful. Now, again, I think you've got to start small, right? If you, even with the claims adjustments department, say of a few thousand people, if you're saying, I'm going to try and tackle this for all 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 claims adjusters, that's probably not going to work, right? So starting small is definitely a critical point. I think the other point, which is really important, is this is not a technocratic exercise, right? These are human beings, and they might have very different points of view of what their abilities are. So we know from surveys that most people actually underestimate the amount of transferable skills they have. So here, understanding and helping people recognize what their transferable skills are, what their skills foundation is, understanding what their attitudes are, because again, aptitude is great, right? But you need people who are willing to actually put in the hours and the effort to reskill, and giving them the right framework for that. So if you look at the stats from a lot of the online courses which are offered, the MOOCs, for example, only 7 or 8% of the people who start a course there will ever end it. And by the way, I'm one of those 93% who have started a course at Coursera or Udemy and have not finished it. It's very, very hard to do that, right, and stick to it and have the discipline to get through. So actually understanding also the framework which is needed to and which is conducive to learning, probably more cohort based, having some kind of instructor-led environment is also critical to make that successful. So yeah, start small, understand that we're dealing with human beings, and create a supportive environment is definitely critical when you're talking about reskilling and upskilling. And then maybe the last point I would make in there is, the HR has been challenged and has struggled for a long time with the credibility issue also when it comes to learning and development spend, right? And I think rightly so. Many people would argue that a lot of dollars have been spent with very little effect. So actually getting buy-in from the business and ensuring that an ROI calculation is not done after the fact so often, but actually is part and parcel of how you plan such an initiative, and how you measure that success at a pilot stage in order to then understand what the impact will be when you scale. That is also very critical from my point of view to any successful initiative.
Okay, thank you for that, Ranjit. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you as you talked about the skills gap by way of introduction, you mentioned those areas which I guess get more prominence, technology, digital marketing, data science. But then, you gave us an example at the insurance processing, which was great because last week spoke with a leader within an organization that manages a different group of franchises, and the way that they call the issue is labor locking, right? And she was sharing that they have literally thousands of inbound calls that they're unable to address because of the kind of issues that you're talking about. So yes, we hear about the skill shortages within the data sciences and whatever, but I mean the issue that you're describing literally covers all segments of the marketplace and work at all levels within those. So it's an absolutely business critical issue. But I just before we move on from reskilling and upskilling, I mean it's something that there's been a certain reluctance within organizations at time to address. I mean, you hear things like, I'm not doing this in order to train people up to then move on to the company down the road. How do you see organizations overcoming, or why do they need to overcome some of those historical reluctances related to reskilling, upskilling, and how are progressive organizations doing this?
Yeah, so first I would say, the attitudes as I see them have really shifted a lot around reskilling and upskilling and learning more generally was looked at as a spend which was a nice to have and could be easily cut in times of recession, for example. And I think that changed for the first time when companies came out of the financial crisis. Around about 2012, 2013, 2014, where companies started to see that they had probably cut a little too deep and were really struggling to get people back in. And they started to think, what would be an alternative path, or what would have been an alternative path? How could we have actually retained people in the organization and applied learning, reskilling, upskilling to keep them in the business and shift their capability set towards wherever we as a company are moving. So I think this was the first time where attitudes shifted to a certain degree, but COVID really made a huge difference there, right? Because on the one hand, the technology gaps just became too big for many companies, right? And I was speaking to a telecoms operator in Australia fairly early during COVID. I would say this was mid 2020, and this was the CHRO, and he was saying, "Look, what has happened is that our workforce plans and what we had thought was going to happen have been accelerated by 3, 4, 5 years, right? And because the pressure is now so big in terms of having to do something and it's having direct business impact, this topic is no longer an HR topic. It is a business topic. It is a topic which is at the top of the CEO's agenda. And I think the other reason why a lot of attitudes shifted here is also because many companies went into a remote mode. They were able to measure and also see, what some of the gaps were in terms of the capabilities of the people, be it around leadership capabilities, be it around technical capabilities, right? And so I can think again there was a real shift which we saw due to COVID. Now, how do you overcome some of the skepticism? I would say the calculation, and again, this needs to be done before initiatives are started typically, right? But the calculation is pretty simple nowadays, right? If you cannot find a data scientist, then significant projects get stalled, right? So the business impact is measurable. It's measurable in terms of customer contracts. It's measurable in terms of your P&L, and therefore you have very few options, right? You can spend a huge amount of money to bring in that single data scientist who's out there in the market, or you actually try to figure out how to reskill your existing talent, right? And so the equation is pretty simple there. And then if you layer on also some of the calculations you can make of how much it costs when you go and get talent from outside anyway, right? A regular hire typically will cost you about 20K, north of 20K, plus the productivity losses that you have. Then retaining your people and actually reskilling, upskilling them is a definite must and makes absolute sense from a financial point of view.
Right. So thank you for that, Ranjit. So I mean, just moving to an adjacent point there. We talked about, we want to talk about how you balance prioritizing business growth with what increasingly people are calling an employee-centered approach. Again, going back to your comments at the start, a manifestation of the macro situation is that many markets are seeing wage inflation rates that they've not experienced for 30, 40 years. I mean, there's always pockets around the global economy of high inflation. I know former colleagues from Argentina will say this is what we deal with all the time. I mean, in many major markets, managers, leaders are dealing with wage inflation levels that they've not managed before. That's also addressed with the impact of COVID on labour market participation rates. We've seen many people choose to step out of the labour market and not showing any great signs of returning. Also seeing higher turnover rates than what has historically been the case. So as you talk to leaders around future-proofing the organisation, what are the kind of steps that they are taking to address those issues?
Yeah, and I think there are really 3 or 4 things that I'm hearing, right? And it is also backed up by a lot of the data around exactly what you were saying, right? When you survey people who have left the workforce and you try and understand, why have they done this? Typically you hear the same 3, 4, 5 reasons. And actually, interestingly, pay is not the top reason, right? And so, in reverse, that also means that you don't necessarily need to drive up pay only to attract people back into the workforce or to retain people within your company, right? But clearly, bad leaders are the number one reason, and that is probably not very surprising, but has been exacerbated now during the last 2 years, because a lot of the bad leadership behaviors, which maybe could have been patched over in an office setting by somebody else in the team, by additional communication, that just simply wasn't possible anymore, right? No career advancement, so that is a major issue. And then what is the actual setup from a workplace flexibility point of view? So can I work remotely? How many days do I need to turn up in the office? Do you have a setup where instead of me commuting, say in a large city like New York or London, instead of me commuting to the main office, do you have satellite offices? Have you kind of flexibilized your office footprint so that I can meet with other people, but I don't have to actually go to that single main office at a central place, which means a 2-hour commute for me, right? So those are kind of questions which a lot of leaders are now trying to address, right? So bad leadership, clearly you can address through supporting leaders. A lot of these bad leadership behaviors are not intentional, right? But can be course corrected through coaching, through other interventions. No career advancement. This is, I think, why a lot of companies are looking at, how can they introduce talent marketplaces, create more visibility around what opportunities there are. It is surprising sometimes at how many opportunities there are in large organizations, which are, unbeknownst to most individuals within that organization who would be interested in those roles, where the company is really struggling to fill them, right? And so there are some very simple ways to solve for that, and then really making sure that you have a clear framework and a clear reason why you have that framework in terms of hybrid work, right? So I think it is not sufficient to simply say, okay, we follow a policy of having people for 2 days or 3 days in the office, right? But you need to both explain why and what the expectations are for the work during those days at the office. There are nice stats which show that many people then turn up in the office only to be on Teams or Zoom calls most of the time, right? Which really doesn't make much sense. It's not a good use of their time. It's not a good use of the real estate. So from a cost point of view, that is really the worst position you could be in. And also probably adapt the layout and the setup of the office space that you do have, right? Speaking of the satellite offices, but also even in office, when you come to the office, it should be about coaching, collaboration, communication, kind of the 3 Cs, right? And if you want to enable that, then you probably need a different layout than what offices commonly have. So I think those are kind of things which I'm hearing in terms of how to actually tackle that. But again, there's been a lot of this has just been happening in these last 24 months, right? So there's very little longer term data showing us, what is really impactful and what is not, and what are the unintended effects also of some of the measures which are being taken.
Yeah. I mean, in prepping for this discussion, as we talked about there's a Harvard study that was done in 2020, but one of the first sort of studies that's now come out with COVID time data talking about the ideal time being 1 to 2 days. We also talked about the former people officer at Google sort of saying that's more in the 3 days a week. But I think for many of those office-based environments, yes, I mean the push to 5 days seems a tough uphill, and I think you're seeing, as you say, that the data is showing that disconnect between what leaders, maybe sort of leaders of a certain age, would like to see, and what the workforce at large is saying loud and clear. And also, as you were making your points, I was thinking to a couple of well-worn phrases within my career. One is that pay is unlikely to be an engine, but it can be a brake. So companies need to make sure that they have things in place. And the trend that we're seeing in pay transparency, I think, is fascinating. And as a way of dealing with gender and other inequalities within pay that we've known have been very stubborn features of the market. I personally have the view that pay transparency will help address that. And also, to your point, people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses, and the COVID has created new management challenges, new leadership challenges. Again, those organizations that are investing in developing their leaders, I suspect will be the future winners. And maybe by way of summary, conscious of the time, Ranjit, because we did get a question which I'd like you to address as part of a summary. It says, what strategies are there to effectively develop leaders in a remote hybrid work environment? Maybe you can tackle that as you summarize your points of today, and maybe future-proofing the organization. What organizations are going to be the winners, and what are the things that they're going to have done better and differently than others?
Yeah, and it's a great question, by the way, which has come in, right? Because in terms of future-proofing the workforce and actually making your organization successful, I would say good leadership is probably the killer, right? So whatever you're able to do to support your leaders and develop your leaders in terms of the basic leadership skills around, communicating, setting priorities, empathizing, but also making decisions, right, is absolutely critical, I think, for success. Even more so if you think of how quickly markets are moving today, and you gotta empower your leaders to be able to make decisions very quickly, right? And that has an impact on everything they do with their team. Stuff that I've seen that really works. I mean, I always go back to coaching as a critical intervention, and one which I think is very underestimated often by many organizations and by many leaders. And funnily enough, if you think of it, right, I mean, we both share a passion around football, soccer, you would never see an athlete, a professional athlete, do anything he or she is doing without a coach. And you cannot think of a footballer or a track and field athlete or a swimmer not having a coach and actually being successful and going to the Olympics and winning anything, right? So for me, I'm always surprised at how leaders are reticent, and especially senior leaders are reticent to get coaching support. Right? And so I think that is a critical intervention with which you can help your leaders. And I would say, and this is where technology has played a huge role, right? If I look, and I spend a lot of time with venture capital firms, and I look at how much money is going into HR tech, right? And where they invest there is a good proxy of where they also see the large opportunities. Virtual coaching, or democratized coaching in that sense, right, is one of the largest categories where money has been invested in over the last, not just 2 years, but I would say over the last 5 years. And that is with a reason, because, and I would, you being a investor yourself, right? Nobody would just invest these huge amounts for soft sentiment reasons. These are hard-nosed investors, and they believe, their hypothesis is that leadership is one of the critical capabilities for success. And if you improve leadership, and the coaching can improve leadership, then you're going to see outsized returns, and that's why they're investing in these areas. So that is definitely one critical lever, and the other one is, I would say, deconstructing the large enterprise, and ensuring that, and the best example is probably Haier, the Chinese white goods manufacturer, a company of I think around about 150,000 people. They've sliced and diced the organization into little teams of 20 to 30 people who operate very, very entrepreneurially, have a business plan for the year, get investment from the corporate center, and then are let and allowed to run, right? And that deconstruction of the enterprise, which goes much further than what is bandied around agile and agile methodologies, right? But it's really allowing teams to be very entrepreneurial, and in an environment, manufacturing and supply chains, which is probably harder than in a service-based environment. I think that's one of the keys also to future-proofing the organization.
Ranjit, can't but thank you again for today. Thank you for those that were attending live, and also those that are getting this asynchronously. We'll follow up with a summary capturing those key points around future-proofing the organization. But again, I'll finish where I started, which was an enormous vote of thanks.
Thank you. Looking forward to having further exchange. Thank you, Iain.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Bye.